What got me it was, I think it was Tuesday the 5th of January, I was looking through the paper and I caught this item about large-scale trouble in Cologne. And it just seemed remarkable that they were alleging dozens of sexual assaults, and that it was a migrant crowd. It was believed to be a migrant crowd, dozens of sexual assaults. And it just stood out as a very unusual thing, or it seemed to be a very unusual thing to happen. I thought about the following day. I wrote to the paper about it, and my initial letter ended up in about three or four papers, and I've written shorter letters to other papers. So I've been in the Independent, the Scotsman, among other papers on it. The story has grown. Initially, we were talking about the size of the mob involved. We're talking about 500 to 1,000 males who were described at the time of North African or Arab appearance. And as some suspects have subsequently emerged, this has been confirmed. The number of assaults has just rocketed. There are now something like over 600 complaints from Cologne. Last time I looked, over 700 victims have made over 600 complaints, including over 300 sexual assaults. I saw a figure in the paper today from a German prosecutor quoting something of the order of 500 sexual assaults. It wasn't clear from the context whether that was a Cologne figure or not, but in all, it was a remarkable figure. And initially there was one rape had been reported. There have certainly been 2 from Cologne, and the prosecutor today was saying 3 had been reported. These assaults didn't just happen in Cologne. I mean, it had been remarkable enough in one city, but it also happened in a number of other German cities, and different reports have quoted different cities. Hamburg, Frankfurt, Düsseldorf have been mentioned, as in other places of other cities. If it was just in Germany, that would be remarkable enough. But similar assaults, though not on the scale, fortunately, of Cologne, have been reported from Helsinki, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, and Austria. It's quite remarkable that the spread of countries across Germanic Europe that had these the simultaneous assaults. Interestingly enough, one of the consequences of this is that finally the dam on discussing these issues is broken in Sweden, and it has come out that very similar assaults took place at a Swedish music festival both last year and the year before, and had been hushed up, no longer. Cologne, however, as far as we can tell, was the worst. Interestingly, there have been no reported problems from the old Iron Curtain countries, nor from Latin Europe. Broadly, what happened that night in Cologne was gangs of Middle Eastern males assembled in Cologne around the main railway station and the cathedral. And there were a certain number of assaults. The majority of assaults were actually gang robberies, where a group of males got round a female or a small group of females and stole property, handbags, mobiles, etc. But somewhere around, I've heard various figures, we're saying perhaps 40% involved sexual assaults as well. The police moved in, and to some extent they moved the crowd on. This actually made matters worse because the crowd divided up into the varying surrounding streets, and the different elements of it assaulted at will. At some point, I think it's Duisburg, a neighbouring city, offered the police reinforcements. They were declined. The attacks in the neighbouring streets intensified, and by the end they just sort of fizzled out as people went home sometime in the small hours of the morning. What happened next is interesting. The following day, on the 1st of January, the Cologne police tweeted that the night had been largely peaceful. That was an interesting tweet. The other thing that happened was the German broadcasters said nothing. But, and this is one of the significant things, the victims and their friends and family started taking to social media. And the sheer volume of comment on the matter on social media forced a backtrack. First, the police admitted there were problems, and then I think on the 5th of January or thereabouts, a major German TV station apologized for not previously reporting it. Once the dam broke, each day, as you read about it in the papers, the number of reported assaults just grew. The Cologne police chief was suspended, in effect sacked. Along the way, the mayor of Cologne, a woman by the name of Recker, there's an irony, came out with the advice that women should really keep men at arm's length, like some sort of Victorian chaperone. I mean, which is to completely miss the nature of that type of gang assault. You know, it's like saying that the way to avoid your boat sinking is, you know, to not have any holes in it. But, you know, since then, Angela Merkel has started to talk tough. This is something who anyone who's familiar with the workings of the British Conservative Party will be well used to. David Cameron is probably a master, one of the greatest living master of talking tough while doing zilch. Anyway, Angela Merkel's not far behind. And so if some offenders are convicted of serious offences, they may be deported. Well, I would have thought that was a German law already. The point about it is anyone who has had any dealings with the criminal law will know that gang assaults at night in poor lighting, where there are problems of identifying individuals, and even if you identify an individual was there, all he has to do is turn around and say, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I wasn't doing anything, the guy behind me was pushing me." You know, I mean, to actually convict most of the offenders is utterly impossible. So once the dam broke and first the Germans covered it, it was picked up by Western media generally. I mean, you'll see it reported on Russia Today, RT.com. You'll see it reported across the spectrum of British papers. And obviously it was reported to some extent on the BBC. The interesting thing is it wasn't a one-day wonder. The story developed over several days as more information came out and more people made a fool of themselves. In a sense, one of the interesting things is, I think as a reader of The Guardian or Comment Makes Free, you'll probably have read quite a bit on this nonsense. Not all comment in leftish papers has been nonsense. There have among it been some quite intelligent comments. In fact, an excellent piece is on the blog of the New York Times. I mean, we know we live in troubled times when the New York Times starts talking sense, or at least somebody on it. Other responses, there have been responses from officials further down the tree. In Bornheim, which is not far from Cologne, local officials banned single male migrants from their swimming pool on a temporary basis. This one, what you'll love, until the social workers have explained to them how to conduct themselves in Germany. I mean, you know, the thought of social workers, you know, telling a Middle Eastern male from a sort of very patriarchal culture how he should conduct himself is hilarious. You know, do they bring along an interpreter and the interpreter said da 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 da, and then, you know, it would be a conversation of the deaf. A Bavarian mayor. Bavaria, of course, is a bit of West Germany that has a sort of very much its own identity, and It's a bit like Scotland within the Union, except perhaps without this direct separatist sentiment. Anyway, a Bavarian mayor, I think Landshut was it? Landshut. He sent a busload of young migrants up to Berlin to Angela Merkel. They stayed the night and were sent back. But I take that and the swimming pool incident as signs that officials further down the tree are exercising a degree of autonomy, and unlike the mayor of Cologne, who is obviously ensured she'll never be elected to anything again, they made decisions which would probably chime with what the people wanted. There are certain essential features about Cologne that make it stand out. It's mass sexual assaults by Middle Eastern migrants. That's the essence of it. The most striking feature of all is the scale. I mean, every barrel, if it's big enough, will have a bad apple in it, or two. I mean, every group in the every group of people, whatever ethnicity or profession or whatever you come across, there'll always be a bad apple. But it's the scale of these that's shocking, and secondly, it's the authorities covered up. Another element that perhaps doesn't come out strongly enough is that the Cologne assaults, that there was suggestions from very early on that criminal gangs that had been resident in Düsseldorf, which is not a great distance from Cologne, had been behind this and had been at the centre of the trouble in Cologne. Now there are parallels here with the various grooming scandals we've had in Britain. For instance, Rotherham. And, the scale of Rotherham, I think it was 1,200 girls over 15 years.
1,400.
The scale is shocking. There have been other British grooming scandals. Again, same as in Germany, it was all hidden, and eventually someone persisted, it came out. The grooming gangs in Britain were linked in the same way as the Cologne attacks, the suggestions of links to criminality. The grooming gangs in Britain links to criminality again. And interestingly enough, since the new year, a thing that's been reported is British Sikh and Hindu associations have been making complaints about sexual assaults on their communities by Muslim males, in the same way as the grooming scandal affecting white and West Indian girls who were in care. There's an ironic term if ever you've come across one. An uncomfortable question that has to be asked is, when do mass sexual assaults normally happen? I mean, they're not a normal thing in any society on the planet. It just ain't normal to have several hundred sexual assaults of an evening. They happened in Tsarist pogroms when they were trying to clear out their Jewish population. They happen in inter-ethnic rioting in third world countries. It's happened when there have been serious riots in India. It's happened elsewhere when there have been serious inter-ethnic rioting. It's one of the elements of it. And the other time it happens is when an invading army against the womenfolk of a hated enemy. And the classic example of that is when the Red Army arrived in Germany with two words of German, Frau, komm. And of course, in that case, the sexual assaults were more serious, and we're talking about 1 million rapes, and it was intentional. It was actually instigated by the senior officers of the Red Army on the orders, ultimately, of Stalin as a punishment on the German people. But the point remains, these mass sexual assaults on somebody else's ethnicity are not a normal thing. It's a very uncomfortable thought. One has to ask, what were the men thinking? And in short order, you've got to say they must have contempt for Western societies and our culture. They must have contempt for our law enforcement, because contempt for our societies would not be enough. They must assume they can get away with it. A troubling little detail. there was an attack on 2 transgender women in Bornheim a few days ago. This gives a further clue to what's going on. It started if I can call it that way, in the normal way that such sexual assault started, with a couple of 3 individuals molesting them. Anyway, the penny dropped that they weren't conventional women, and the 3 attackers tried to stone them. I mean, that is actually quite striking. Excuse me, this is a Western society. Stoning is no part of our culture, nor is stoning is no part of our culture, lynching is no part of our culture. And when I say us, I mean say anywhere, any European country that is of Christian culture and Western Christian origin. These things are no part of our culture. But these young men thought that it was acceptable to do that here. Fortunately, the police arrived, and for once the 3 culprits were taken promptly into custody. It suggests a remarkable sense of entitlement. You can go to someone else's country, molest their womenfolk on a mass scale, and stone people you disapprove of. I mean, that's really quite stunning. And you have to ask, how can a Western country integrate such people? And to ask the question is to answer it. The next question I want to ask is, what were the police and the broadcasters thinking? And the unfortunate conclusion is that they were thinking in politically correct terms, in which they had to protect the vulnerable, in inverted commas, minority, in inverted commas, from anything that might harm them. I mean, it is actually, the only word to describe the conduct of the police and the authorities is actually unnatural. In any society, in any era of history, outside the politically correct West, if there had been mass sexual assaults on the local population, there would have been a raging response. Now, I would in no way advocate that people take the law into their own hands. But for the authorities not simply to do nothing, but to suppress the truth, attempt to suppress the truth, and then come out with various comments blaming the victims, it is literally unnatural. You know, I mean, if we saw what happened to that engineer when he described the national sausage in some Central Asian republic as a horse's phallus. Now, I mean, to a Westerner that might simply be humour. The man had to be smuggled out for his own safety. You know, that is the response in a non-Western society to an insult. And frankly, insulting the national sausage is probably rather less serious than molesting the national women. You know, I mean, I think that's the same anywhere on the planet. Only in a politically correct Western society could the response of the authorities have been so out of kilter. I mean, in one word, actually, I mean, you can blame it as political correctness. Another way of looking at it is it's a complete lack of manliness. You know, you don't actually need any education to know that having your womenfolk involuntarily manhandled on a large scale by foreigners is not acceptable. You know, any country, any culture on the planet would take exception to it. You know, they really, the part of the lesson of tonight is, frankly, Europe's elite and the leaders of our public authorities simply have to man up. But what were the causes? I mean, you can look at the causes of this in any number of different levels, and I'll just throw a few at you. I mean, there's weak policing, non-existent immigration enforcement. A lot of this sounds familiar to anyone who's lived anywhere in Britain. Weak enforcement of the criminal law. As I mentioned earlier, in Dusseldorf, which is only I think 30 miles from Cologne, had been plagued over the last year with North African criminal gangs of pickpocketing and so on. They hadn't suppressed that, so the problem sort of got metastasized and got worse. The scale of immigration, I mean, 1 million people of alien culture into a society in a year is a lot. Now, a country can take a very large number of immigrants in a short period under certain circumstances. Germany took 12 million Germans who'd been ethnically cleansed from Prussia and East Prussia in a matter of months in 46. You know, and it worked because they didn't have any choice. The Red Army was insisting on it, but they spoke the same language. Their culture was broadly the same. They spoke the same language. Their culture was broadly the same, and you know. So you can get mass-scale immigration provided there's compatibility. And if you look at the United States of America, they were taking perhaps 1 million a year or more over many years through Ellis Island. But it worked on the principle that people were going to accept the American way of doing things, that people wanted to be American, they wanted to join in the American dream, they wanted to make a new life for themselves. But for a society to take 1 million people who don't get the script, that is rather different. Culture of political correctness, I mean, it is undoubtedly one of the fundamental causes of this. But taking it back a stage, one of the causes of what happened is the international conventions going out to the Second World War. In two in particular, the Geneva Convention on Refugees and its 1967 protocol that removed the limits on it, and the European Convention on Human Rights. And the interaction of those makes it very difficult to actually remove anyone. And ultimately, as a cause, I would have to say that the one I would finger the most is psychological weakness. I mean, Osama bin Laden is reputed to have said, and as a proverb it'll last 10,000 years, between a strong horse and a weak horse, people will always choose the strong horse. And he was right on the money on that. If you show strength and you indicate you're a strong horse, people will choose you. If you endlessly show that you're a weak horse, people will fight against you. I mean, you could, in terms of causes, one could write doctoral theses and only scratch the surface. But another question to ask about Cologne and what caused it was, what was Angela Merkel thinking when she invited the Middle East to Germany? You know, in the late summer of last year. And she's saying that Germany could take 1 million migrants per year for 5 years. Now, in one sense, you can understand the fertility rate of Germany is somewhere around 1.41 to 1.44 children per woman on average, and that is just about 2/3 of replacement. Replacement's round about 2.1 children per woman. So you can understand that they were aware in Germany they had a demographic problem. In terms of what she was thinking, there are certain assumptions that Angela Merkel must have had and are common to our political and media class. One of them is religion and culture doesn't matter. Another is that migrants don't need to adopt to our values, we need to accommodate theirs. And the one that is really mad as a field of hares on mescaline is equality for women and sexual minorities is consistent with multiculturalism. It isn't. The decision was definitely never thought through. Nobody would convince me that the decision was a carefully thought out decision. If it had been carefully thought of, they'd have considered the demographic consequences. Now, the demographics of Germany, there are around about 80 million Germans, or residents of Germany, shall we say. The 7 million residents of Germany, or thereabouts, in 2014 were not citizens. As of 2008, 2.5 million of them were Turkish citizens. 750,000 Italians, 700,000 Poles. So it's not just in Britain that we have Polish immigration. Since 1987, another 3 million people of German extraction have come to Germany from the former Soviet bloc. Now, the recent migration in the last few months, it's 1 million people from the Middle East. It's 75% male. Nearly all are of breeding age. You must understand that birth rates are above replacement in the Middle East, though actually less above replacement rate than you would think. I mean, Algeria is about 3.0, and I think Morocco is only 2.4. But their populations are significantly younger. Because this immigration to Germany, the million, was 75% male, you will need another 500,000 females to balance. When you consider family reunion rights, and that on average they will have more than 2 children, if you take the 1 million this year follows through to at least 3 million. And if you do that each year for 5 years, you soon clock up 50 million or more. And remember, the German age structure is not an ideal one. Because they're breeding at under replacement rate, it's 50 million people makes a substantial proportion of their future population. Each of these factors I mentioned acts as a multiplier. So 1 million, thinking you're going to get 5 million people and it's going to sort your demographic problems. Well, it may sort their demographic problems if it happens, but it will create other problems because you will have a country that is culturally divided. What about democracy? I just asked this in passing. It's clear from thinking through the demographics that Angela Merkel took this decision with her kitchen cabinet, her close associates. Nobody ever sat down and wrote, let alone read, a report on the demographic implications of this scale of migration. Now, if they never thought about it themselves, they never put it to the German people. It's quite remarkable that you would actually take a decision that would have such a marked effect on the future character of your country and its cohesion and its effectiveness without actually consulting the people. But it's clear it never was. Of course, it's not unusual for the liberal elite to sort of ad lib and then expect the rest of us to accept it. Well, the consequences of Merkel's decision for the EU are very interesting. The first is internal borders are being thrown up right, left and centre. Sweden, I feel I have to repeat the word Sweden. If there's a politically correct country that doesn't get the plot, it has to be Sweden. Sweden has thrown up controls on the Öresund bridge, and there are now not direct trains from Copenhagen to Oslo. So there's a problem when the Swedes are trying to control entry. The Danes, as a result, have reacted and have put temporary controls on their border with Germany. Numerous East European countries are throwing up border controls on their border. Perhaps most significantly is Bulgaria, which is building a fence along its border with Greece. That's interesting in the sense that they obviously conclude Greece is hopeless from a border control point of view, because obviously it's a whole lot of islands, and how do you keep people from arriving on islands if they've got boats? Schengen, which did include 26 European Union countries, is effectively over. Sure, there are some countries that haven't thrown out borders yet, but a substantial chunk of the EU has thrown up borders, and they won't be able to get rid of them. Another consequence of Merkel's decision is our recent agreement with Turkey, under which they get 3 billion euros in the first year, and something they've been wanting for a very long time, visa-free entry for around about 80 million Turks to the European Union. There's an interesting twist on this, which is that the flows through Turkey into Greece and up through the Balkans, Turkey's a security state. Turkey could have turned off those flows at any time they wanted. They're supposedly our allies in NATO, but their conduct in recent years would make us think that that is something that will have to in future be re-examined. Anyway, for now they've dulled the flows a bit. And the biggest conclusion is that when there's a problem, Brussels is incapable of an intelligent response. It brought to mind actually a piece of poetry unusually, The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. And it starts, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." There's two lines in that strike me as right on target. The first is the centre cannot hold, and undoubtedly Brussels can't. And the second is the old one, the best lacking all conviction while the worst are full of a passionate intensity. Anyone who has dealt with progressives will know they're utterly full of passionate intensity. Reason and evidence-based decision-making are, well, not a design feature, but they're certainly full of passionate intensity. And there's another line, the very last lines, "And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born?" And I interpret Yeats's last lines as a warning against demagoguery. And undoubtedly that is something we should hold in our heads for the future. Why didn't it happen here? Well, in short, the first reason was the English Channel. And I'm going to quote one of my favourite lines from Shakespeare, or a few of them. "This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat, defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England." It's one of the best of all Shakespeare's quotations. And the bit about that serves us as an office of a wall or moat, utterly right on target. A second reason it didn't happen in Britain is because UKIP is tapping in to the concerns about mass immigration. David Cameron was thus obliged to bow to public opinion and limit entry to 20,000 Syrian migrants from the camps over 5 years. But don't feel too cheery. Anybody who becomes an EU citizen or a family member of an EU citizen can come here under free movement rights. Also, anybody who has family here could potentially come here under family reunion rights under the European Convention. Indeed, there is currently a judicial review being launched by 3 migrants resident in the jungle camp at Calais that they should be allowed entry for family reunion. And the Calais camps are not going away. Well, what next? Mass flows of migrants continue. Libya is still a failed state, so even if the flows of migrants are controlled to some extent via Turkey, they're not going to be controlled from Libya. So anyone in North Africa who wants to come to Europe, they just get to Libya and they can be smuggled across to the foot of Italy and then just progress. From October 2016, Turkish citizens will have visa-free entry. Interestingly enough, Mundell says that Cameron's going to hold our referendum in June, before the high season for migrants coming from the Middle East to Europe. A prudent move, perhaps, on his behalf. Well, I guess there's a positive. Patriotic parties who are cautious about or opposed to mass immigration will prosper throughout Europe. And whether they're the good guys like us, or in some other countries that maybe not quite so good guys, any party that is patriotic, nationalist, genuinely nationalist, so that'll cut out the SNP, will prosper. You know, where do we go from here? Is the next question I'd ask. Well, Merkel's decision and behaviour of the authorities rests on demonstrably false assumptions. And part of our role in UKIP and in the wider sane part of politics is to expose the insanity of their assumptions. I would say that we have no alternative but to either abrogate or amend the two key treaties. The Geneva Convention on Refugees and the European Convention on Human Rights. It wouldn't, even if you abolished the Geneva Convention, it would make not the slightest difference, and I'm not advocating that, but even if you were to abolish it, it wouldn't make the slightest difference, because anybody who got here would still be able to claim a protection issue under the European Convention on Human Rights. You either tackle both conventions or you're wasting your time. I think one of its potentials is it finally breaks up the Rainbow Alliance. Well, our older people here will remember when Ken Livingstone ran London in an appalling fashion. And basically every left-wing cause of any kind, whether you were Irish Republicans, you know, conservative Muslims, feminists, gay rights activists, or whatever. Basically anyone except anyone who was productive or family-orientated or patriotic. They were all gathered together in Ken Livingstone's Big Ten, what the left called the Rainbow Alliance. Well, the news for them, the Rainbow Alliance is over. You cannot have women's rights, gay and lesbian rights, transgender rights, and have mass immigration from patriarchal conservative societies. You've got to choose. Now, I much prefer women's rights and gay rights to cultural change. I think that, you know, our society, that it links to freedom to a certain extent, and the world will keep turning. But the reality is, it's not for me to choose, it's for the left, because there is no way they can have both. Cologne has made that utterly, utterly clear. And more than anything else, I think what we've got to do is remember Osama bin Laden's proverb, between a strong horse and a weak horse, people will always choose a strong horse. And rediscover psychological strength. In fact, Europeans, well, not the East Europeans who haven't lost it, but Western Europeans basically have to man up. And to go back to the title of my talk, is Cologne a turning point? Well, I guess the answer is no and yes. The flow of migrants continues. The psychology and ideology of the political class in Brussels and throughout Western Europe is unchanged. And the refugee conventions and the ECHR have not been amended. However, the yes that is a turning point, I would say that German war guilt is at an end. That is the consequence of what Merkel's mad decision last year. The Germans will wake up and start to behave like normal people rather than carrying a sort of collective guilt that they've carried for the last 70-odd years. The issue of mass Middle Eastern migration is now a live issue everywhere in Europe, including Sweden. And that has got to be a positive, because once people start to talk about it, then there will be change. I think another great positive is that Eastern European nations have shown that they are still nations. They acted, and several East European nations acted off their own back. They didn't wait for orders from Brussels. Indeed, the Northern European nations have started to act on their own initiative without waiting for Brussels to tell them what to do. And these are all positives. And I think the other positive is the social media are a real weapon on the side of liberty and sanity. And if I could close, the point of these points, so many of these things are core UKIP issues, that the nation state should take decisions, not Brussels. That's core UKIP. That we shouldn't have mass migration that will overwhelm our public services or change the character of our countries. That's core UKIP. That it's for the people to decide rather than being told what to think by the elite. That again is core UKIP. So yes, it is a turning point, and it's one that UKIP as a party and people who think like us can profit from.